The exam will open up on Friday. Should be about 50 multiple choice questions, and then some short answer and essay questions. You good? Okay. In the meantime, you have a problem set that's due that you've already been working on. That should be helpful to you. Today, we're going to move into big picture study of macroeconomics. And kind of what we've covered so far is issues having to do with economic growth, the factors that are involved in improving our quality of lives, and how that's happened over the long run. So we've been dealing with Solo's model, relating capital to output. And we realize that we get to some sort of a steady state based upon the golden rule steady state would be one where we maximize consumption. We also realize that we've never quite gotten there. That we're somewhere below it. And in part that's because the y as a function of k is continually growing. We've got some factor of technology and other factors involved in producing economic growth that keeps pushing this upwards. And so we keep on expanding and growing. Today what we're going to walk through is the model that you all learned in your intro macro course, which gives us sort of a footing from which to move forward and build a more complex model. You can get by in life not knowing any economics at all. Actually, the whole world can get by with nobody knowing any economics at all. The economist isn't necessary for there being an economy. The economist's job is simply to provide information, the relevant opportunity costs of alternative changes in policies so that the public in deliberation can make decisions. The public could make appropriate decisions without the help of the economists if properly constrained. They don't always do that. The fact that the Netherlands and England early in the 1800s landed upon a set of institutions that encouraged economic growth is a historical accident, one that we're all very grateful for. But it's a historical accident that has generated this wealth. It's nothing special about the Dutch or the English or the Scots, for that matter, that allowed for the economic growth to get started. But we do know that it was a miracle that it happened, and we're grateful for it. In thinking about long-run growth, we can relate this similarly to the simple concept of a production possibility frontier, where the full employment capacity of an economy is described by the production possibility frontier. And if the economy is growing, this production possibility frontier is moving outward over time. We can similarly extend this idea to a description of our quality of life over time. We talk about how our quality of life over time has been increasing gradually. And in the United States, that's happened at a rate of between 2 and 3% a year, which we recognize as providing a doubling of quality of life every 30 years or so. Fascinating. We didn't know what we were going to do last night, my family and I. All had worked all day really hard, studying and preparing. Both of my daughters are in college. One of them is taking an intermediate macroeconomics class this semester, actually. the other's taking your class in the economics of engineering. And so everybody was sitting there doing probability statistics and economics. My wife is taking a course with Professor Stephen Hall this semester, and she was studying economic theory as well. So we're all four of us sitting there doing economics late into the night. and we watched an episode, after we finished and got tired and brains were full, we watched a couple of episodes of The Wonder Years. Have you ever seen The Wonder Years? This is where Fred Savage got his start. Fred Savage, the kid from The Princess Bride, he was on this TV show called The Wonder Years. It came out in 1988. And it was about the 60s era. As a matter of fact, the TV show starts in 1968. And I remember when The Wonder Years came out as a TV show. But it was only 20 years from 68 to 88. And it's been 32 years from 88 until now. So it's been longer since the TV show came out than what the TV show was showing. But the quality of life that people enjoy today, as compared to 1968, in some ways is fascinating, a dramatic difference, and in many ways is not all that different. All the kids were healthy, there was enough food, they had cars, they had TVs, at least the characters in the TV show did. Not everybody did. So where is that improvement in quality of life? Where is that most felt? In many ways, it's not most felt here in the United States. In many ways, it's not felt the most by those of us who have the privilege of going to university. In many ways, that improvement in quality of life is most felt by people far, far away, where the economic development is just barely reaching. And yet, we have 2 to 3% growth in the economy annually, give or take some. Now, we all know that this economic growth that we've experienced is not linear. It's not constant. It's not stable. Instead, there's a lot of variation about a trend. And the trend, there's nothing to say that that trend is going to continue in the future. We hope that the institutions that we have in place remain well preserved. I'm becoming concerned that that is going to be the case. But we know that there's been these fluctuations over time, and we call this the business cycle. Well, having explained, at least in some degree, or having developed a theory for economic growth, that can be counted as describing the supply side of the market economy over time. And so if we have 2 or 3% growth every year, we might be able to put that on a different graph and say, okay, we can say that the economy is growing 3% a year. And our expectation about economic growth can be 3% growth a year. So then I would put on this axis economic growth, or real GDP growth, or per capita, real GDP per capita growth rate. This is not how Mankey does this. However, this is how Cowan and Tabarrok describe the aggregate demand, aggregate supply scenario. I think it makes a little bit more sense. It made more sense to me. So instead of putting big Y, as Mankey does, on the x-axis, and big P for the price level on the y-axis, we can make this more dynamic and talk about the rate of growth over time instead of the absolute level of output. We can talk about the level of growth of output, or the rate of growth of output. And instead of talking about the price level, we can instead talk about the rate of change of the price level, or inflation, the inflation rate. Making it dynamic like this is going to be helpful to us when we also put our aggregate demand curve on this same graph. This line is going to describe our long-run aggregate supply curve, or our expectations about economic growth from here going into the future. We expect maybe not 3% growth, maybe 2% growth from here going into the future. We'll build out the rest of this model later on in class, but before that, I want to talk a little bit more about this business cycle business. We can break down the business cycle into various pieces. We have here a peak, and here a trough. The time period between a trough and a peak is considered an expansion. And the time period between a peak and a trough is called a recession. Currently, our present recession looks like this. It looks really bad. And we're going to look at some more figures about the current recession. However, if we just look at unemployment rates, about half of that's already recovered. Now, we'll see what happens with this new wave of the pandemic. The puzzles that we're going to deal with moving forward are, first, why is there a fluctuation? Why isn't it more steady? What factors are involved in causing there to be peaks and troughs, to be expansions and recessions? Secondly, what policy vehicles are available to various institutions to try to reduce the volatility of the fluctuations, to try to smooth the curve and make the peaks and troughs less extreme? And a question that we ought to always have in the back of our minds is, well, if the peaks and troughs are smoother and the growth rate is the same, who does it benefit to reduce those fluctuations? Does it benefit some at the expense of others? Or does it benefit everybody? It's not immediately obvious who benefits by smoothing the curve. In particular, it's easier for firms and the government to make plans about what to do in the future going forward if it's more smooth. However, we learned from the consumption smoothing model earlier in the semester that when there's a peak, most people will already have in mind a level of consumption that they're going to maintain throughout their lives. And if there is a peak, they'll just smooth that peak over the rest of their lives going forward. Similarly, if there is a trough, they will smooth that out over the course of their lives. So then that ought to automatically build in a stabilizer to these fluctuations. That's not necessarily what we observe. The next and other big question that we want to leave in the back of our minds, but not ever to forget, is does the business cycle facilitate or encourage or enable economic growth in the first place? Is it because we have these fluctuations that we get growth? And if we tamp down these fluctuations by reducing the amplitude of these fluctuations, could we actually cause economic growth in the long run to decrease and have less economic growth over time? By ensuring stability or trying to maintain stability, do we perhaps in some ways give up the liberties that are what is essential for the economic growth to obtain in the first place? Is there a trade-off there? That's exceedingly difficult to show empirically. Okay. The next thing that we want to think about is, if there's going to be a trough, can we predict it? Can we get ahead of this animal a little bit at all? So that if there's going to be a recession, can we predict that there's going to be a recession? And in so predicting, can we do anything to mitigate it and make it less difficult or less harmful? In order to try to achieve that prediction, the government is engaged in making those kinds of predictions in part by start by looking at what's called the Conference Board's leading economic index for various variables that could be predicting a recession. The Conference Board looks at least this set of variables, and in so doing tries to predict whether or not there's going to be a recession in the near or distant future. So what I've done is I've gone through and I've pulled up, this is a news release from them, and I pulled these up ahead of time. This is the aggregate of all of those different variables compiled together. So this index is the leading economic index, the blue line. And notice that before the recession in 2000, in 2001, called the dot-com bubble, this index's measures indicated that a recession was coming. The variables that it measures moved down before the recession actually hit. This gray bar demonstrates when the recession was in effect. Similarly, before the 2007 recession, the variables started to show that there was a recession coming, and sure enough, that was the big recession of 2008. Similarly, in the recent days, the variables took a huge dip, but there wasn't as much of a lead time this last time around. Why? Well, because the pandemic hit really quickly. There are those who would claim that they had evidence of variables that were indicating a recession coming. Among those are two professors here, David Thomas and Jim McClure. Some of you may have had either game theory or intermediate micro with them, and perhaps they talked about this a lot. My guess is that they at least mentioned it. I think the research is pretty persuasive, and I think that Professor Steve Horowitz also was working on that. By the way, that's special. The fact that those professors are here, that you have access to them, and that they are producing cutting-edge work that is effective and coming about to be true in many ways. Don't take it for granted. If you have the opportunity, take a course with them and learn from them directly. The red line is the coincident economic index. This is showing that, well, a recession has happened. And notice that the blue line and the red line cross at the beginning of the gray bar. So this is coincident with the recession. Okay, and here's a simple indicator of economic growth over time. I want to open a few more graphs. So we're at our good friend Fred, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, that provides all of this data for us. And I recommend that you play with that website, that you go back to it again. Some of you use it for problem set 1, but I recommend that you go back to it and look at it and see what different kinds of variables are provided in it. Notice here we see, what is this? The weekly hours of production. We have a lot of production going on between February of 1940 and August of 1945. Why do you think production went above 40 hours a week during that time period?
After the war.
It was for the war, not after, but during the war.
When did you say?
So between 1940 and 1945, that was during World War II. So the level of work and output that the United States was producing was well above what we consider normal, a 40-hour work week. People were working 45 and 46 hours a week. Why? Well, they wanted to win the war. Okay. Then we see over time, an average of around 40 hours a week. Then there's a recession here in late 49, early 1950. The number of hours dip, and again another recession. So we see these gray bars the thing that you want to start to gain a habit for looking at is those gray bars, thinking about them as, well, that's a recession. And we see the line dipping down when there's a recession, pretty regularly. Okay, and here's a 2010 recession, and then if we zoom in, you can zoom in by moving this bar at the bottom. So here's a recession, 2008, 2009, and here's where we are today, with a huge dip. This is a measure of personal consumption expenditures. I believe this would be in nominal, not real terms. How much are people spending? It is the amount of money that people are spending going up or down. Here's a peak of 14%, so real expenditures went up by 14% for that time period. And it looks like, over time, there are various different rates at which people's spending is increasing. But again, we see spending decreasing during a recession. How much? Not by a whole lot. So for non-durable goods, consumers have to spend money to stay alive. They have to spend money on food and clothes and the essentials of life. And so for consumption, we don't see a decrease in spending that is very large. And in general, we see consistent increases in spending, except for the worst portions of a recession. Right? In 2001, during the dot-com bubble burst, we didn't even see consumption go negative. People were still increasing the amount of consumption year over year throughout that time period. And then through 2008, 2009, it dipped down by about 4%. And here we have today. So another thing that you can be observing from all of this is, this time is different. This time is pretty bad. Right, again, another measure of consumption expenditure over time. Here we have uninsurance claims. How many people are claiming on insurance or unemployment insurance? And here we have what, 4 million people claiming unemployment. And here at the peak we have 6 million people claiming unemployment in 2009, at the peak of the last recession. By the way, what may be a little bit interesting about all this is the fact that population is growing at the same time. And so, you look at a number in 1975 of 4.5 million people unemployed, and then you look in, let's look here, the most recent time right before the recession, 1.7 million people unemployed. Well, the denominator is a lot bigger in 2019 than it is in 1975. The population of the United States is probably nearly doubled since 1975. So this is really quite impressive. And of course, we have a peak unemployment rate of 22 million people in May, and we're back down to 11 million people in October. Why do you think the unemployment rate fell? Was it because people went back to work, or was it because people stopped looking for work? I think in this case, most people went back to work. For this recession, I think most people went back to work here. In part because we wanted them to stop working, didn't we? We gave them, $1,200 per person to not work so that we could get people out of the workplace and flatten the curve. And once that $1,200 ran out, people are going to go back to work and how to eat. In the last recession, we had a peak of around 6.5 million people unemployed, and it took a long time for unemployment to creep back down. The spike wasn't quite as dramatic as it was here in 75. Okay, and part of this has to do with older folks leaving the workforce and then not returning. And here we just have a measure of the unemployment rate. And again, I want you to think about just how when this peaks, that's during the recession. It goes up during the recessions. Unemployment increases during recessions throughout. Any other thoughts here as I'm doing this? How is it that the unemployment rate has been relatively steady when the absolute population of people who are unemployed also seems to be steady. It must be that we have a relatively consistent number of people in the workforce over this time period, which means that there are more and more people who are not in the workforce, which must mean that those of us who are working are becoming more and more productive. And today, less than half of people in the United States work, and we have a quality of life higher than ever before in history, and it's because we're that much more productive. What do we have here? Manufacturers' orders for durable goods. So how many millions of dollars of orders are there for new goods? And we see this increasing over time. Notice manufacturers, 2008 through 2009, people weren't buying stuff. People were not buying, in particular, what kind of stuff? Durable goods. What kinds of goods are durable? Cars, houses, factories. Okay. Manufacturers new orders, so people buying stuff for capital goods that are non-defense or aircraft related. And notice we have millions of dollars increasing. Got a recession, increasing, recession, kind of slow here. The purchase of capital goods was kind of slow throughout this time period. This is year over year, new purchases. Okay. This is future new orders. And again, when you're looking at these graphs, you're going to want to look at the gray bars. Notice how it's dynamic over those gray bars and then gradually descending and then jumping back up and gradually descending. So this is the new orders for what? What does it say? Changing orders for manufacturing firms. Okay. Here's housing. How many thousands of units are being built? Notice we've had relatively slow development of new housing over this time period, in particular relative to the time period leading up to the most recent recession. And some people say there's a housing shortage right now. A lot of people having a hard time finding housing in big cities. I'm skeptical about the idea of there being a housing shortage due to a lack of new building in particular. For one reason is that, houses today are much, much, much bigger than they were back here in the 1960s. Most houses are twice the size that they were back then. And because of that, there's fewer small houses being built. That has to do with code laws and zoning laws and who can build where and the rules that HOAs put in place and Karen not wanting unfavorable social elements moving in nearby her, which I think is disgusting. Okay, there's people that want to get their kids into decent schools. Well, the decent schools are in the rich suburbs. Well, there's no reason that a few low-income families couldn't go in on a house together in the suburbs and split the rent and thus be able to get their kids into a decent school, except that the HOA doesn't allow more than one family to live in a house. So they put these laws in place to crowd out people who might find ways to move up otherwise. And it's the kind of thing, I normatively oppose that. You don't have to agree with me, but that's my normative sentiment. This is about consumer sentiment. So are people feeling optimistic or pessimistic? This is an index. So this is some sort of an arbitrary measure that the University of Michigan puts together. Are people feeling good or bad? Well, when people are feeling good, the economy is growing. When people start to feel, pessimistic, the economy will take a dip. And that's during recessions. Notice the pessimism was building before the recession here. The pessimism sort of showed up overnight here in 2000, 2001. And boy, we're pessimistic right now. This is the bond yield on the Treasury. And we'll talk more about Treasury bonds when we get to monetary theory, after I have some more time to actually study these details so that I can talk more eloquently about them. Notice we can expand and zoom out and look big picture. So we had this massive spike here in 2007. Notice, right, treasury bonds and issues related to treasury bonds are financial market related, primarily about financial markets. And this recession was really a financial market recession. It had a lot to do with finance. This current recession is not as much to do about finance. The 2001, 2002 dot-com bubble was not so much about finance. Okay, so this is sort of an indicator that primarily shows what's happening in financial markets. Here's a picture of some stock markets. And what is the fully capitalized price index of the top 500 or 5,000 stocks that are listed? And again, just looking at the gray bars, when things go up and when things go down. Notice that if I zoom in, let's try to zoom in on 1990 so we can get a more dynamic picture of what happened there. By zooming in, it seems like a bigger dip than relative to the big picture. And I think that it's important to think about, this is what we were just looking at here a second ago. It's important to realize that percentage changes are what really matters. So what we would probably want to do is take the logarithm of this data in order to show the percentage changes to have a better idea of the dynamics. Here's the Dow Jones. Notice the Dow got up to 362 points here in 1929, and then dipped and landed down at 55 points. So it was a huge dip. Now, how much of this was fake and how much of it was real is hard to tell. Might be a good indicator of where it landed, maybe not here, but here. Although the components of the Dow would have changed. Which stocks are listed on the Dow would be different here than what we're here. But we have observed a lot of good growth since then. Finally, this is a picture of Okun's Law. You saw this graph in your textbook. Each dot is a year for the United States. And the idea here is that, or each dot is one quarter for the United States. The idea here is that if in that quarter, the unemployment rate goes up and is positive, and so the change in the unemployment rate is positive, so unemployment has gone up, we expect that when unemployment has gone up, let's look at this dot right here. This one's at 1%, really close to the trend line right here. Then if unemployment goes up by 1%, then we expect GDP to go down by 2%. Here, unemployment went down by 1%, and GDP growth went up by about 4%. So the idea is that there is this 2% or doubling the percentage relationship between unemployment and GDP growth. When unemployment goes up, GDP growth goes down. When unemployment goes down, GDP growth goes up, and about by twice as many percent as the change in unemployment rate. What I want to do now is talk a little bit more about the Cowan-Tabarrok version of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. You can read the Mankey version, and I'll go over it briefly near the end. But I think that the Cowan-Tabarrok version of this makes a little bit more intuitive sense. And if you want to go and review this, you can always go to Marginal Revolution University and watch the videos on this. So mru.org. And the videos are also available on YouTube. And so you're going to want to look for where they describe the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model in there and how they build it. This aggregate demand piece has to do with monetary theory, which we did talk a little bit about already. You'll remember that M times V equals P times Y. The change in money the quantity of money times the velocity of money is equal to the price level times real output. There's a theorem called Euler's theorem that says that if we want to find the change in money and the change in each of these variables, we can rewrite it by saying that the change in the supply of money plus the change in velocity is equal to the change in prices times plus the change in real output. Now the change in price, this is inflation, or pi. And the change in output is real GDP growth. So then, P and Y are the variables that I have put on this graph. Rather, real GDP growth and inflation are the variables that I put on this graph. In that case, what can I say about the change in money plus the change in velocity? That is captured in aggregate demand. So just think about how graphs work for a minute. A movement along my aggregate demand curve would maintain the same overall M plus V. A movement along the aggregate demand curve would have the same aggregate demand added up. It would just be that the portion of aggregate demand that is related to price and the portion that is related to real GDP growth would vary. So then I could have an inflation rate of 8% and a real GDP growth rate of negative 2%, and that would be consistent with an aggregate demand of 6%. What that's saying is nominal spending growth year over year has increased by 6%. The amount of actual money exchanged is increasing by 6%. However, 8% of that is due to an increase in prices, and negative 2% of that is due to a change in actual real stuff. So are we better off or worse off given an aggregate demand of 6%? We can't know. We have to know how that's combined. If it's more inflation than growth, then we're actually worse off in real terms by 2%. Although we might think ourselves to be better off because we have more money flowing through our hands. Similarly, we can find ourselves in a place where there's 4% inflation, right? And I guess it would be closer to here, 2% growth. 4% inflation and 2% growth. And then we would have positive growth in the world. There's real GDP growth in this story, 2% positive. And it's on the same aggregate demand curve because the sum of that 4 and that 2 is still 6. So nominal spending is still 6%, but the dividing up of that spending, 4% of it is due to an increase in inflation, but 2% of it is due to real GDP growth, real ability to buy stuff that we actually want. Any questions so far? So then, that's a movement along the aggregate demand curve. A shift of the aggregate demand curve would be a change in nominal spending. So the whole aggregate demand curve could shift. In that case, either the quantity of money or the velocity of money will have to have changed such that our aggregate demand is, let's say now it's at 9%. How that gets divvied up, it could be anywhere along this line, right? Divvied up between a change in price level and a change in actual output. But that 9% represents an increase of 9% actual spending of nominal dollars in the marketplace. What kinds of things could cause aggregate demand to shift? Perhaps some brand new technology that makes us so much more productive. Or maybe just consumers are a lot more optimistic. That could shift aggregate demand out. There's a lot of variables or a lot of things that could cause aggregate demand to shift positively. What could cause aggregate demand to shift negatively? Consumer pessimism, investor pessimism could cause aggregate demand to shift. A change in the quantity supplied of money exogenously by the government If the government massively increases the quantity of money being produced, we should see a rightward shift of aggregate demand because there's going to be higher nominal spending. If the government, for some dumb reason, reduces the quantity supply of money, we should see a leftward supply of the aggregate demand curve. That's what happened during the Great Depression. There was a negative aggregate demand shock, and the government thought, oh, the best way to solve this is by reducing the quantity supply of money. That was the wrong thing to do. It made it even worse. Well, usually when we draw this graph, we have our long run aggregate supply curve. We have an aggregate demand curve. Usually there's a short run aggregate supply curve. And Cowan and Tabarrok describe this as our expectations about inflation. They've jumped to the end of the story, in a way. This concept has to do with rational expectations, which is a theory that was developed much more recently in macroeconomics generally. The idea here is that if there is a change in aggregate demand, in the short run, that is only going to be, it's only going to affect markets to the extent that the increase in nominal spending is greater than the expected increase in nominal spending because of inflation. And once people realize, oh, what's happened here is, perhaps a monetary shock that has boosted aggregate demand, in the long run, people will update their expectations about inflation such that there's a new short-run aggregate supply curve with that new expectation about inflation baked in. And that is how the economy self-corrects in what Mankiw would call the classical model, or the neoclassical model. Without any intervention of the government, this is the process that we would expect to emerge. Well, this is a positive shock. Nobody's ever really worried about the positive shock. The concern comes when instead we actually observe a negative shock. And in this case, the shift in aggregate demand pushes us below our potential level of productivity, which is sort of similar to moving inward on the production possibility frontier. So there are underutilized resources, and the idea would be, well, okay, we will eventually get back to a new short-run aggregate supply curve, and the only thing that will really have changed is the price level, or our expectations about inflation. No big deal. However, when we are in that trough on our long-run growth path, all kinds of bad things happen, particularly political things. What happens if you lose your job? You might get pissed. At who? Well, maybe at first your boss, but then you're stuck at home bored, and so during recessions we observe increases in domestic violence. Who else might you get pissed at? You might get pissed at God, all right? You might get pissed at your neighbor. Road rage incidences, I bet, also increase. You might get pissed in general. You might go out and protest. After all, you don't have to go to work, so you got free time. So you see an increase in political protests during recessions. And who's most concerned about the political protests? It's the elites who are already in power that don't want to see their government overthrown or changed. And so those who have the most incentive to end the recession are those who are in power. So their motivation is don't just stand there, do something. But they don't always know what to do. And sometimes they make it worse. So the idea here is, okay, we have a recession, maybe caused by a shift in aggregate demand. Is there anything that can be done to get us to boost aggregate demand back out so that we don't have political turmoil? And there are two different basic approaches to changing aggregate demand, to influencing aggregate demand. One is fiscal policy, and the other is monetary policy. Fiscal policy gets done through Congress, monetary policy gets done through the Fed. Now the puzzle for us for the rest of the semester is, can we model the different fiscal policy approaches that exist? Can we model the different monetary policies? Can we provide any kind of analysis using empirical facts to ascertain which of these works, when, and how well? When Mankiw focuses on, and this is sort of his brainchild, so of course he focuses on it, but he also takes it from Keynes, is he has a model where in the short run, aggregate supply is flat or horizontal. And under that assumption, if there is a shift in aggregate demand, negative shift of aggregate demand, we get even more unemployment than we would get if the short run aggregate supply curve was somewhat elastic. Here it's perfectly elastic. If it's somewhat more inelastic, right? Even worse, shock. And then this distance is analogous to, not empirically the same as, but analogous to the amount of time it takes for the economy to correct itself. And the longer the time it takes for it to correct itself, the deeper the trench, the more the political turmoil, the more likely it is, you kick the cat on your way in through the door. So Mankiw focuses on the two different scenarios where aggregate supply is perfectly up and down, like long-run aggregate supply is. This is the assumption of classical economists. Look, the economy corrects itself. Don't worry about it. Versus Keynes' concern, look, prices are sticky in the short run, and it causes problems. Is there something that we can do to correct this? Could we boost aggregate demand again, such that we get back to equilibrium? And in these models, it's helpful to know that home isn't at the dot necessarily. Home is along this line. When we're back to full employment and back to reaching our potential economic growth. Anytime we're not along this line somewhere, we're in trouble. And this is home for you. Okay, I think that's all of really what I wanted to cover today. That's pretty much the center of what is in this chapter for this week. The exam should go live Friday. Homeworks. Has anybody turned in homework yet? Okay, I will start to try to grade problem set 2 so that you get some feedback about your understanding of that material. If you all get together and want to set up a time for a collective office hours or a Zoom session, I'm open to that and available for that. So I need at least 3 people to make that worth my time. And I might just have open office hours anyway. Any last minute questions, thoughts, complaints? All right, see you.